If you have your Bibles, and I hope that you do, turn to the book of Philippians as we continue our study of Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. I love this letter. It's a great letter. Paul has a deep friendship with this congregation and of this group of believers, and so he's writing to them just with the heart of a friend as he writes to them, and with so much joy that just floods his heart as he's writing that letter, even in the face of trials that he's facing. And so it's a fun letter to do that. But Philippians chapter 1 is where we'll be concentrating this morning. But before we go there, I just really have a question. What motivates you? What motivates you? What do you live for? What are you willing to die for? What really gets you going? Now, it's important that we think about what motivates me, because what motivates me ultimately moves me. It gets me doing something.
Yes, amen.
What motivates me will move me. Now, I have 3 children. And those 3 children are all different in some way, shape, or form. Now, my middle son, Carson, loves to sleep more than his older brother. Nolan's always been late to go to bed, early to get up. Carson, not so much so. Carson likes to sleep. In fact, he was so exhausted Saturday that he slept until lunchtime, because he was just out of it. But there's something crazy about Carson, because if you get him something that motivates him, you give him a reason to be up in the morning, and he will be up before everybody, ready to go, dressed, breakfast, everything. It's crazy how that is. He is at it. Other days, he's out cold, and school is not a motivator for him at all. Just so the teachers are aware of that. Now, when I lived in El Paso, no one put that first picture up there. In El Paso, it's at the very southern tip of the Rocky Mountains, and right there, splitting El Paso in half, is the Franklin Mountains. And that was the view, I think, from our church parking lot. If I believe there's a junior high school there, and then there's some of the mountains. And if you look to the mountains on the right, with the 3 towers on top, those were the second tallest peak. The one on the left was the tallest peak behind us. And splitting the difference between those 2 mountains, there's a slight valley there. There's Trans Mountain Highway that would cut across from one side of the mountains to the other. And right there you see, one day I just was driving because I was bored as a day off, and I lived my first 4 months in El Paso by myself. And so I was bored on my day off, and so I drove up through the mountains, and there's a little pullover place, a little park you could park there, and I just thought, I'm just going to climb to the top of the mountain. And so I got out of my car, and I started scaling the rocks up the side, not aware that there's actually a hiking trail that walks you all the way to the top. I was just like, I am going off-road totally. Now, I did that. I got up a little bit, and then I'm like, I better go down. And so I went down because I got scared. And I drove home, and then the next week I came back and I tried it again. And I got a little bit higher, and I think that's the pictures I took there, and I have other pictures at home where I was just taking some different pictures and selfies because I was like all pumped because I got higher, scaling up the side of the mountain. Well, then, as I'm living by myself, also in the mornings and the evenings, I started bike riding. And so I was doing a lot of riding in the morning and the evening. At one point, I decided I'm going to train to do what I can to get from one side of the highway to the other that goes through the mountains. Now, there's a few thousand feet elevation change on that ride. And so I was training to do it. So every morning and every evening, and then every once in a while, I'd get real gutsy, and I would turn and start riding up the road that heads up to the mountain. It was about a 3-mile drive on an 8% grade just from the starting point to it. So I'd get about a mile up, and then I'm like, I'm dying. I'd turn around, and I would go back. Now, I was motivated every morning, every evening to keep riding to do that. And at some point, my family moved there, and that motivation changed. And my wife wouldn't let me buy a bike that I really wanted to be able to make the adventure. I blame that on her, but it's really my fault because I quit training. But it was fun. That was motivating me every morning. I'd get up and ride a few hours in the morning, then a few hours in the evening, training to do that. Well, then I still had it in myself that I wanted to get to the top of the mountain. That was motivating me to action. And so a friend of ours flew in and was visiting with us. And so me, him, and Nolan went to the top of the mountain. I think it's the peak on the right is the one we went up to. And we hiked all the way up. We actually followed the trail this time. And we bought we bought gear and everything. It was a lot of fun. It was a day trip, just walking to the top. And Nolan probably never ate so many granola bars in his life. And so it was fun. We made it to the very top of the mountain. And in fact, in my office in there on some shelves are little pieces of rock that we actually took when we got to the very top. I don't know if they would appreciate that, but we made the mountain, an eighth of an inch shorter by taking one of the rocks off of there. But we have it in my office just as a memento of that moment. And while we were doing it, we took some pictures of the adventure, and Nolan had some very motivational sayings to say, because he at that time was about the age of Allie Grace, 2nd or 3rd grade. And so Nolan put that first picture up. These are motivational teachings from Nolan. Adventure. It is a good thing we are climbing this mountain instead of sitting at home watching TV. That's one of them. And then the next one. I like this next one. Encouragement. I hope you don't die, as our friend Ben tripped and fell and slid about 20 feet and everything. And so it was hilarious. Nolan's encouragement for the journey. But what motivates you? What gets you going? Am I motivated beyond the moment? What is the impact or the legacy of what motivates me? Does it have eternal impact, or is it just temporary? What motivates me? Why? Because what motivates me moves me. Now, when we look at Philippians chapter 1, we really get a sense of what motivates Paul. So Philippians chapter 1, as I lost it. Now keep in mind what's taking place as Paul is writing this, because Paul is in house arrest. He's most likely in Rome. Caesar's elite forces, the Emperor Nero's elite team of guards, his secret service, is chained to Paul. 4-hour shifts every day. So there's Paul chained up under house arrest to a guard, different guard every 4 hours, but Paul is still allowed to minister. Paul is still allowed to have guests. He's still allowed to do his thing. So imagine this, because you have Paul there. Most likely Timothy is with him, his mentor, his student, or mentoree, his student, one of his closest friends and colleagues in ministry, and most likely he is dictating what to write to Timothy, and most likely Timothy is writing most of it down as he's there. And I can only imagine what that experience had to be like for the guard next to him that Paul is chained to, as under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul is dictating a letter that he's sending to his close friends in Philippi. I can only imagine what that was like. I suspect it was probably impossible for that guard to not become a follower of Jesus from that experience. But there he is. That's what's going on. He is under house arrest, chained up, dictating a letter, and watch what he reads, starting in Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard. I mean, he's telling the guard next to him what the guard already knows. I've heard about this Jesus guy. I've heard about this Paul that is crazy about this Jesus guy. He's heard about, the whole guard is aware of who Paul is and what Paul is all about. And he's just talking about that right there. And to all the rest of, and it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest, that my imprisonment is for Christ. Here he is locked up. Everybody knows why he is there. It is gone through the imperial guard, and most likely through the government structure in that local government in Rome, in the imperial government, it has filtered through. They're aware of why Paul is there. He continues. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerity, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Here we have what motivates Paul. What gets him going is to make lifetime followers of Jesus. What gets him excited is seeing people come to faith in who Jesus is. He's under a big trial. He's chained, which none of us want to be chained up. None of us want to be confined. But then, on top of that, not only is he under trial, not only is he being persecuted for his faith, not only is he being mistreated for that, then in top of that, he has individuals that are making life miserable for him. He has other individuals that are jealous of who Paul is in God and what he's accomplishing for God. And so their attitude is, hey, we're going to become preachers now so that we can correct every way that Paul is wrong. So you have them kind of stepping in, being like, hey, we're rivals of you, Paul. We don't like what you're all about. We don't like the way you're approaching things, so we're going to fix all your wrongs. And probably they had a little bit of arrogance to them, and they're like, God's judging you, Paul, because you're just not doing it right. So you have that group of people on the inside of believers that are doing the same thing to him. So his trial is big. But then he chooses to have joy in the reality that even in the midst of what's happening to him and towards him, he has joy because Jesus is being proclaimed. Some with right motive and others with wrong motive. But his trial is being used to encourage people to proclaim Christ. Because they see Paul shut down and they don't like it. And so their response is, Paul's not able to preach anymore. We have to fill in for him. We have to do something about that. So there are a group of people that have stepped up and they're like, okay, Paul can't preach anymore, so we're going to take up the slack and we're going to begin to preach for him. That's awesome. So then Paul looked at it with joy. Rejoicing. Because that's a significant thing that's taking place. Because the emperor at the time is Nero. And Nero was starting to go crazy. And so as he's going crazy, he begins to persecute Christians very brutally. To the extent where, from what I understand, even there were times where he would stake Christians out on poles and light them on fire and use them as lamps. And then you have the whole arena where Christians were slaughtered in the arena. You have all that taking place. Nero was very godless. And so that's beginning to percolate in the background of that tension. And so what's our natural tendency when persecution comes, when resistance comes? Our natural tendency is to start to get quiet, to shy back, to be a little bit hesitant on what we're going to share. We're going to be a little bit reluctant to be really bold. And so Paul's trial became a motivator to get people to stand up for God and to step out. Even in a culture that was very godless and against them, they were willing to stand up and do something. Yes. And that creates joy for him. What motivates you? For Paul, his motivation was to see lives change, to see people receive Jesus and to be mentored in him. That gave him joy to face the trial. Now, what trials maybe are you experiencing in your life? Maybe it's persecution. Maybe there's people that are against you or even family members that are against you for what you believe. We have a culture that is shifting in its attitude toward the things of God, and we're right in the middle of that storm, and we don't know how that's going to pan out in the attitude of culture towards the church. But what trials are you facing? What setbacks? What unexpected news? What things have you encountered that you're facing? What trials are you going through? What are you experiencing? And then how do you respond to that trial? How do you respond? Now, sometimes our response to a trial is to get really pouty. We're just like, well, I don't like this. We get really bummed out. We're just like, rah, 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 I hate that. Rah, 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 rah. You ever been there? We gripe and we complain. And that's the interesting thing, because when you read Paul's letter to the church, to his friends, these are close friends that he's writing to in this letter, a close bond between him and the Philippian Christians. And he doesn't vent. He's not sitting there going, oh, man, today I got guard Brutus. The guy does not bathe. And he won't listen to me, and it's horrible. And he doesn't do any of that venting or griping or complaining. He's not like, oh, this is the worst. Man, there's people that are stabbing me in the back. People that I've known, that maybe even have traveled on the preaching team with me or I've interacted with before, that we've had conversations. They're turning their backs on me. They're horrible people. They're ridiculous. There's no woe is me as he writes to them. In fact, he doesn't even give a lot of information about his current situation because he's so joyful about what God is doing that he's not focused on the trial. So, how do you respond to your trials? Paul's joyful because his trial has motivated others to make a stand for Jesus, but also his trial has positioned him in a place that he would have never been had he not gone through the trial. Had he not gone through the trial, he wouldn't be chained every day to different guards. Every day, an opportunity to have a very close conversation about who Jesus is. Of every day, these guys, he would have probably never met them, but he has this opportunity. Now, as he's ministering to the guards and the other government officials are aware of what's taking place. So, a whole group of people he might not have ever been able to encounter, but because of his trial, it gave him that opportunity to be around them and to minister to them. I mean, God can use the trials that you face to reach people you might not ever have been able to be around before. Now, we would prefer not to have the trial and to have everything to be joy. But God can use these moments to do phenomenal things in people's hearts and lives. As Paul's writing and he's talking about this, he's even sharing his heart as he's pouring out his heart to his friends in Philippi. And at one point, he even starts writing to them in that next paragraph. He's just like, you know, it would be awesome if I could just die and I could go to be to heaven and I could be with Jesus, but he gives me the opportunity to be here. And so I'm going to make the most of every moment that I have while I'm with you, because it gives me the opportunity to reach yet one more person for Jesus. It gives me the opportunity to influence them, to mentor them, to encourage them, to strengthen them. And so as he shares that, but then he gets to verse 27 and he says this, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a dear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation and of that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. He's like, whatever trial you're facing, live in a manner worthy of Jesus. No matter what you're going through, live in a manner that there is joy in the midst of the trial because you're living for Jesus. You're exalting him. You're worshiping him. You're seeking him. No matter what you face, live in a manner worthy of Jesus. That means face a trial. Don't turn your back on him. Face a trial, don't suddenly use that as an excuse to be worldly and ugly. When you're facing a trial, use that as a moment to grow and to mature and to develop your relationship with God and to use it as an opportunity to share Jesus with others. Amen. Sometimes our trials can be the greatest way to open up a conversation with other people. Yes. Because we have something deep we can talk about and relate to with them. A story to tell, a testimony to share. Most of the time when we're in a trial, we want to say, I would rather be anywhere but here. I'd rather be anywhere but here. I'm sure Paul did not enjoy this. I'm sure he didn't. I'm sure he wanted to be anywhere but there. Most likely he'd have rather walked out of the doors of that house arrest, out of that jail, wherever he was, and walked out into the street and to be proclaiming Jesus again. But he wanted to be anywhere but here. But he made the most of the moment that he was in. Now, we can tolerate a trial when we know there's a purpose for it. We can tolerate a trial when we know there's a purpose. Now, there's some trials we face that we don't really see the purpose, and it's really hard when we walk through those things. But when we know there's a purpose, we can face the trial. And Paul made sure he had a purpose for the trial. He made sure. I'm going to keep proclaiming Jesus through the midst of the trial. I'm going to keep living for Jesus in the trial. I'm not walking away from my faith in the trial. And that's what the opponents wanted. They were like, hey, if we just keep Paul quiet, if we keep him in jail, he's going to be quiet. This whole Jesus movement's going to die off. Unbeknownst to them, it caused it to thrive instead of die.
That's right.
A trial will only silence us if we allow it to.
Amen.
It'll only silence me if I allow it to. Or a trial can be the tool that God uses for our greatest triumph.
Amen.
It can be a tool God uses to be glorified, to do great things. I mean, it caused Paul joy when he saw how his trial was inspiring others to live for God and to make God known. It caused him joy. There was a great breakthrough that happened there. It didn't silence things. There was breakthrough. I like what James writes in James chapter 1. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, when trials of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. When you have a trial, consider an opportunity for joy. The trial becomes joy. Trial, joy. Why? For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing.
Yes, thank you, Jesus.
My trial can become joy because I allow it to do a work in my heart, in my life. My trial is an opportunity for me to personally grow. I personally develop. My trial is an opportunity for me to reach and inspire others. trial. Consider it joy. And that was what was so amazing about Paul, because that's how he approached the trials. And that's something we can do too.
Yes, amen.
That no matter what difficulty we face, we consider it joy.
Yes.
No matter how hard it is to walk through, we consider it an opportunity for Jesus to be glorified, for Jesus to change lives, for him to change hearts. So I walk through it with joy. I avoid my temptation to want to turn my back on God, or to just shut down, or to be gripey and complaining and ugly. But instead, I take a moment to celebrate what God is doing and can do through the midst of it.
Yes, thank you, Lord.
I celebrate how God can use that to inspire others to carry on where I might not be able to continue because of the trial. But I don't quit. I keep going. And then in the midst of it, I allow God to do the work that he wants to do in me. Because none of us are perfect until we get to meet Jesus face to face, and then that's a whole new ball game. But from here till then, we're growing and maturing and developing, and we want to allow God to continue to do that work because we want to be fully mature, complete, lacking in nothing.
Amen.
And when we're lacking in nothing, it's when we're most useful to make the biggest impact for our Savior in people's hearts and lives. And our ultimate goal needs to be to do what we can to fill heaven with people.
Amen. Yes.
That's right.
Needs to be our ultimate goal.
Yes.
I mean, our purposes as followers of Jesus are real simple. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's our relational things, but then it's our commission, our mandate, our marching orders from our God of go into all the world and make disciples. Go into the world and make followers of Jesus.
Yes.
Helping people to meet Jesus, to know him, and to grow in him.
Yes, thank you.
But no matter what you're facing, what trial, they're not fun to go through. No trial ever is. But approach it with joy.
Amen.
And let's see what God will do.